excited about this talk.
Oh, thank you. No, it's really good to see you again, Flavia, and it's nice to be involved again. Always happy to be involved with you guys.
Let's see. Let's just wait. Okay, now we have the official okay to start our talk. Good night, everyone, or shall I say good day, everyone, since we might say good morning or good night, good afternoon for the others. Welcome to Tecnopuc Talk. I am Flávia, I'm Executive Manager at Tecnopuc from Porto Alegre, Brazil. Just a couple of words for those who are joining us for the first time today. Tecnopuc is the technological and scientific park of PUC University. Today we host around 170 organizations that involves more than 8,000 people in this innovation ecosystem that gathers startup R&D groups from global companies and local companies as well, consolidated ones and startups, all of them deeply connected to technology, innovation, creativity, and all this cooperation approach. So this is our third talk that we are having since the distance measure were implemented in our region. The first talk has focused on our national innovation ecosystem when we received the president of Amprotec, Francisco Saboia, and the second one was about the regional situation during this pandemic time, when we had with us the president of Regimp, Arthur Gibon, that they are probably watching us right now. And today, now we are going overseas. Today we receive Patrick Hollingworth, the author of Ligth and Fast Organization book, and a big inspiration for us. Patrick is based in Australia, but has an international approach since he has clients all over the world. He is a business consultant with an academic background in anthropology, geography, and psychology, isn't it? Is it right, Patrick? So, Patrick, thank you very much. We are very happy and excited to have you with us today. Please present yourself and say hello to everyone that are with us.
Thanks, Flavia, and good evening to everybody. It's nice to be with you. It's 10 o'clock in the morning here in Sydney, so we're on the different sides of the globe. Good night to you and good morning to me.
Thank you, Patrick. So we are gonna start our talk. This is gonna be an informal talk that we arranged before. For those who already interact with Tecnopuc knows that your book, Ligth and Fast Organization, is a huge inspiration to our organizational model. Since 2018, we have been implementing this new way of managing our institution. But more than that, we are more than implementing, we are also have been learning a lot and studying a lot. Before the expression VUCA has become a trend topic, we have assumed this world as an environment for seeking opportunity, besides then the risk environment. So to open this talk, I'd like to invite you to talk about Ligth and Fast concepts, where you develop a comparison between business environment and the mountaineering, alpine style and expedition. So let's start with that.
Yeah, sure. So I wrote the book about 5 years ago, and I was working with that concept of VUCA, which is the acronym for volatility, uncertainty, complexity, and ambiguity. That VUCA concept, which I'm sure most of you are familiar with now, had been around for a number of decades. It had its origins in the American military, and then in more recent times has been applied to, I guess, business context as a way to describe this seemingly new environment, this environment where volatility and uncertainty and complexity and ambiguity were the norm. And what I was doing was also delving into my other, not only my professional background as a consultant, but also my own personal interests in mountaineering. I've been a mountaineer for a number of decades and done a lot of high altitude mountaineering in the Himalayas. And in the book, I was using the simple metaphor of mountaineering and contrasting between the traditional mountaineering approach which is very orderly and planned and methodical, and a newer type of mountaineering approach, which is much less ordered. It revolves around smaller teams, being a lot more agile, a lot more responsive, a lot faster. And I was suggesting that perhaps the world of business could understand or learn something from mountaineering in terms of these different types of approaches. And so just to contrast the difference again, expedition style mountaineering is very much a large team approach. It focuses on trying to reduce the uncertainty of the environment around it, and really reduce the difficulty of the mountain that it's trying to climb, really trying to overwhelm the mountain with lots of people and lots of equipment and lots of fixed infrastructure. Whereas alpine style is much more about smaller teams, 2, 3, 4 people at the most, where they don't try and reduce the uncertainty of the mountain environment, but rather they work with the uncertainty of the mountain environment. They don't rely upon all of the equipment and all of the fixed infrastructure. And rather, with less equipment and less infrastructure, they can move much faster. So that's sort of the benefits of the alpine style, or the light and fast approach. So that was the basic metaphor that I describe in the book. And essentially I describe the light and fast methodology as perhaps a more appropriate methodology for trying to move in this VUCA world. Perhaps I could unpack the notion of VUCA just a little bit more, and in particular focus on the C within VUCA and what the C stands for, which is this notion of complexity. And there's a relatively new body of work, a body of science around the science of complexity. It sort of has its origins from chaos theory, which has been around for 40 or 50 years. Complexity theory is sort of 20 to 30 years old, as is network science, so the science of networks. And networks essentially are the structures of complex systems. And really a complex system is a network of lots of different parts which are all connected to one another. And the increased level of connection between parts is what leads to increased complexity. And the basic sort of thinking is that our traditional organizational approach, and indeed our traditional approach to government and to managing in general, was established in a world that was not particularly complex, or that was not as complex as it is today. But today we are seeing increased levels of complexity as a result of increased levels of connectivity. And I would suggest that connectivity derives from two key things. One is connectivity via the internet. So that's not only more people connected to more people, but also people connected to infrastructure and machines, and more machines and infrastructure connected to more machines and infrastructure. And then secondly, globalization, the ease with which people until COVID have been able to access relatively cheap international air travel. So people themselves can travel around the world much easier, which means you've got continents and countries which are much more connected. So combining this increased connectivity of people, increased connectivity of information, you have a landscape or an environment which becomes a lot more volatile and uncertain and ambiguous as a result of that complexity. Does that make sense? Completely
makes sense a lot. And considering this kind of, I would focus now on the dynamic of a network, and considering work relations and people in the second block, I would say. So I remember that the first time we met, Patrick, it was in Porto Alegre when you were here for a lecture in the MBA on digital transformation at PUC. And by that moment, I had the opportunity to share with you what we were doing here at Tecnopuc in terms of flat organization and the challenges that we were facing by that moment. Something that caught our attention at that moment, it was a graph representing this network without the dots, without the nodes. So got pretty clear for us when we talk about network model, we are talking mainly about connections. And here I would ask your permission to use a note that I've taken during your class. When you said being light and fast is not about process, it's not about things and people, because this we can see. It is about the connection of them. And from that day on, the graph that we use at Tecnopuc had a completely different approach. We represent our nodes as a group of responsibility, not representing an area anymore. And the main focus would be on people moving through the lines. So one of the biggest lessons that we have learned during the process of implementing, it was the need of increasing highly the communication between people. We need to create a safety zone for that. And needless to say that probably many of us here are facing this experience of exponential growth of communication. We all know that we have a bunch of tools that can provide this good infrastructure, as you were mentioning. But what about the creating this safety zone for people, be confident to take their decisions, to express themselves? That is some aspect that we keep seeking at Tecnopuc, not moving from digital transaction, but to a digital interaction, now that we are not physically in our places. Since we've seen many companies forced to move their operation to a virtual mode, what's your perception regarding communications nowadays during this pandemic time? And after that, of course. How do you see people interacting, but not just talking through virtual world?
Sure. And maybe before I answer the question, I'll make a statement. Connection changes the nature of things. So I think we have a tendency to view things in isolation. But once we connect something, the nature of that thing that has been connected changes. And so when you talk about interactions, I would say, yeah, that's absolutely a key point. We tend to base a lot of our thinking as if things and objects are the primary concern. My point is, what if interactions and relationships are the primary point of concern, and things then kind of become what they are as a result of those connections? So what's an example? So the pandemic poses a really interesting problem, because on the one hand, it's forced us to physically isolate from each other. But then on the other hand, it's forced us to communicate and share information in the digital space. And so we're now all working from home. Having meetings such as this is commonplace. And the connection is quite easy. But then paradoxically, we're not able to physically connect with one another, because to do so would enable the virus to spread. So when you think about it, the attempts to stop the virus spreading are simply attempts to stop interactions between people, because the virus is simply passes from interactions between people. So what point am I making here? I guess I'm trying to show the paradox that on one hand, we are socially isolated, and we have to isolate as a means to stop the virus transmission. But on the other hand, we need to connect more than before, and we can only do that in the virtual or the digital space. So does that make sense?
Yeah, makes sense. And how do you think, how do you see this developing for the new way of organizations running their remote teams?
Well, I find it very interesting, because many organizations for at least a decade have been undertaking digital transformation and working with remote teams and some people working from home and lots of different approaches, and some have been successful and others not so successful. And then something unexpected like COVID-19 comes along, and in an instant it forces these reconfigurations, or it overwhelms the inertia that was previously there. Because if digital transformation was so easy, we would have all been working like this 10 years ago.
Yeah.
Because the technology, it's better now than what it was 10 years ago, but for the most part, you could still work remotely 10 years ago. But all of a sudden, something else has come along and really forced this change upon us. And then very, very quickly, the reconfigurations have occurred. And for the most part, I don't know how you guys are finding it in Brazil, but here in Australia, for the most part, people have transitioned to working from home very, very quickly and quite successfully. To the extent that there's a lot of discussion around will there be a return to full-time work in offices? And a lot of people are saying they don't really want to go back to an office full-time, maybe 1 or 2 days a week. But the need to commute for a long commute into a city to work in a big office is perhaps no longer necessary.
Yeah. That is one of the points that we have been discussing a lot, because this is a regular discussion that when we talk about our tech park, we keep telling people that it is not about the place, but about the connections that are able to happen. And this is a reality that we faced when people left physically the park. We saw our digital connection increasing highly. We had an exponential increase on interaction with the companies. So it got pretty evident that our model, it is running besides the buildings, besides the companies physically there. So for us, it's a really good reality. But we think if many companies would come back to a model where the physical interaction or the linear structure, organizational, would be tried to get back, maybe. I don't know how you see. Do you think this is gonna keep?
Look, it's interesting to watch. And in terms of your traditional linear kind of organizational structure, here in Australia, we often refer to it as silos, or different departments which tend to be separate and isolated from each other. And the light and fast approach, and indeed a complexity and network-based approach, is about trying to remove silos and distribute across the organizational network the capacity to make sense of what's happening out there in the world, as opposed to the traditional approach, which might be to feed information all the way up to the central part of the hierarchy and then to feed it back out. When the world is changing, or when the environment changes so quickly, the siloed approach tends to fail because they become overwhelmed because the information is changing so quickly. So if you look at the civil unrest, the race riots in North America at the moment, now to begin with, they were about Black Lives Matter and protesting the unlawful death of George Floyd. But within the matter of 1 or 2 days, the nature of the protest has moved far beyond that. And it's talking about much more systemic problems in the United States. And to try and keep up with all the information that's out there, it's very, very difficult to. And I find that most traditional news outlets are not up to date with what's happening. So I use Twitter myself as my primary source of information. I have about 80 sources I follow on Twitter, and to me, I've established that they're reputable, they're trusted sources, they're from they have different approaches, and but that gives me what I think is a fairly representative view of the information and of the events as they unfold. And then that enables me to actually to understand and synthesize what's happening, instead of the more traditional approach, which would be to simply wait for your large media outlet to tell you what's happening. So my point is that I think the Ligth and Fast organizational method is much more akin to distributing and everybody having the ability to interpret events, rather than simply waiting for one central sort of authority to tell you what's happening, because that centralization tends to be quite slow. It lags. And when the world is changing so quickly, there can be you risk not being able to respond fast enough. Does that make sense?
Yeah, completely. Makes a lot of sense. We are having now some questions from the audience. And let me see, we have a question from Leandro that's part of our startup team at Tecnopuc. And I have it here. The concept placed in the book Ligth and Fast is interesting, and much more interesting when we relate to the digital transformation we are experiencing. Whether as customer entrepreneurs or simply employees of these companies. However, if we analyze the startups, I see that they are born with this Ligth and Fast spirit. However, at the same point, they tend towards to the more alpinist style. How do you see this anti-transformation that happens when startups become big companies? And how can they avoid this anti-transformation?
It's a really interesting question. So yeah, startups generally are in the post-digital world. So they don't have a pre-digital analog legacy. So they don't necessarily need to transform, or at least when they begin, they're generally very small. And they are light and fast, and they're agile, they're responsive, they can move very quickly. The original sort of motto for Facebook was move quickly and break things. In the early years, that was sort of Mark Zuckerberg's approach. But Facebook is a good example. It started out as a bunch of people in a dorm room at Harvard, I think it's Harvard, and now it's a huge, it's one of the biggest companies in the world. But it's nowhere near as responsive or agile as it once was. And that is, of course, the problem with any organization that experiences rapid success, is that it grows very quickly. And in order to try and, regulate and manage that growth, management sort of organizational processes are put in place to ensure that the growth happens in a controllable way. The paradox, of course, is that management and that organization approach can then actually constrain the organization. And whereas in the early days, it was able to reconfigure and move and shift and respond very quickly because of, the management intent to try and introduce more order, it paradoxically reduces the organization's ability to shift and change and evolve. And so what I think is interesting is so essentially it becomes a problem of scale. If you've got a company of 5 people or 15 people or even 45 people, you can kind of shift and move quite quickly. Information can be disseminated very quickly. Once you sort of scale above to 150 or 450 or even 1,500 people or 5,000 people and then 15,000 people, you begin to see how a lot of the lower order ability to respond is lost because of the increase in scale. In a way, the numbers that I'm referring to are known as Dunbar's number. Robert Dunbar is an anthropologist who's hypothesized that humans themselves don't have a brain capacity to maintain more than a set number of relationships or interactions at a time. And so it sort of works off the idea of and it's something along the lines of 5 people, 15 people, 45 people, up to 150 people. And that kind of feels about right. Maybe you've got, 3 to 5 very close friends, and then you've got a broader friendship group of maybe 15, and they fit within a broader friendship group of 45 to 50, and then that fits within a broader community of 150. But it's very, very hard to scale beyond that. And I think that's what a lot of organizations trying to scale up and grow, they face that problem of trying to scale beyond a size in which human relationships have evolved to work and be effective.
That's perfect, Patrick. I will keep in mind this lesson, and for sure we are going to spread for the startups that we are supporting and helping to develop here, because this is a key point to be connected with the complex moment that we are facing, not now, but on business environment in general.
And that's another challenge, because as an organization, as it becomes successful in its early days, and as it starts to scale and grow, at the same time, inertia develops within the organization, because the company has been successful, it's growing to be more successful, and in order to be more successful, there is resistance to change anything. And so that manifests in terms of a type of inertia. And again, that is the challenge, I think, for, so I run a very small consulting business. I mean, I operate under my own name, but I've also got a small consulting business with 3 or 4 of us. And we're trying to not scale, because we don't want to scale, because we think that if we scale, we then lose that opportunity to continue to be out on the edge, doing fairly progressive, creative, new things. And so what that means is that we tend to always be exploring, looking for new opportunities and new ways of doing things. And then rather than trying to scale up ourselves, we try and pass that information on to others who might be better at scaling. And then we move to new areas to look for new approaches.
Yeah.
And so rather than one organization trying to scale up, it looks a little bit more like a collective of many different smaller startups, I guess. And it's similar to what you do at Tecnopuc, the ecosystem of many different startups. And I think that an ecosystem that is comprised of different smaller scale organizations or startups, meaning the ecosystem is very diverse. I think that the value lies in that ecosystem, as opposed to simply one organization trying to dominate everything else.
Yeah.
So that's why I was always really interested in what you've done at Tecnopuc. And when I visited last year, to see and really to be on campus, you get a sense of that ecosystem, because you've got many different companies. And I remember walking in, I forget which particular area it is, where you see on the wall and you see the names of all the different organizations there, from the very large to the very, very small. Yeah. And that to me said, this is an ecosystem which has diversity. And from the natural sciences, we know that an ecosystem which has diversity in it is naturally more resilient. It can be much more responsive to change. Whereas an ecosystem that lacks diversity, if the ecosystem is a monoculture where everybody and everything is the same, because you've tried to configure it to take advantage of one particular context, when the context or the environment changes, the ecosystem can be wiped out very, very quickly. Yeah. So that's a bit of a comment about a systems level approach to building resilience in an ecosystem.
Very, very interesting, considering the effort that we do to maintain the connections between small startups and huge companies with their R&D huge centers. And what we can see now that we are not physically there is that the connections happens, and now they are happening with our help, our support, and whatever. I knew that this half an hour would goes really fast, but I still have one question that I want to share with you.
Of course.
How does the virtual collaboration connect with the real collaboration? How to have this?
Yeah, and so it's interesting. So we are now here we're having this conversation virtually, But I think the conversation is much richer because you and I have met in person.
Yeah.
We have spent time in the physical space together. And I think that the virtual space is great for collaboration and working from home, not having to go in the office. A lot of this has been enabled. But at the same time, I think that working purely in a digital space is quite difficult because when you're in the digital space, you can lose the context and you can lose a lot of subtle nuance. So if we were having this conversation together in a room, in addition to the verbal cues, we would be making eye contact, we would be reading each other's body language. You'll pick up on a lot more subtleties that you don't in the virtual space. And so that's why I think, with anything in this world, is that it's not about one thing or the other, but a combination and understanding context and when is the right context for one approach and when is the right context for another approach. So, for example, if you were running an organization or a startup that was distributed geographically, let's say you had 20 staff working across 10 different cities in Brazil. I think that obviously can work, but at the same time, I think it's still important to, on some regular basis, actually have those 20 people physically in the same space. And whether that's once a year or every half a year or once a month, I don't really know. But it's about getting kind of the right combination, because I think to work purely in a digital space, it can happen. But I do still think there's a lot of benefit to the actual personal connections in the real physical world.
I agree with you. We are doing very well virtually right now, but we are anxious to get people together, to have a barbecue together, to have a coffee around our meeting. For us, that's really important. And
and again, I think it
would be the best.
The balance. I think it's about the right approach for the right situation. I often refer to this as simply, being able to read the context or read the situation and then be aware of what an appropriate response to that situation is. Now, given the pandemic, the situation has been that we can't physically co-locate, but we know that won't be forever. Whether it's half a year or 1 year or
that much.
But we know that at some point in time, whether or not a vaccine is developed, whether or not, even if it's not, the disease, I think, will become endemic across populations. But I mean, in Australia, we're very lucky. So compared to where
you're very smart, I would say, very smart on your
smart and lucky. Smart and lucky in a way, because we are, like you, we're a very large country, but we don't have the large population that you do in Brazil. The Australian population is about, I think it's about 24 million. What's the Brazilian population?
I don't know.
How many Brazilian, what would the Brazilian population be?
I lost the connection here. I can't hear you, Patrick.
Can you hear me now?
Just a second, I lost you here.
Oops.
Let me ask help. Oh, sorry. No, I'm back.
You can hear me?
Yeah.
Okay, so I was asking, what is the population of Brazil?
Around 200 million.
Yeah, 200 million. So the Brazilian population is about 10 times that of Australia.
Yeah.
And yet our land mass is quite similar.
So you are far from each other.
We are far from each other. So we are not densely populated. And so I think that's one reason that we're very lucky.
Because it's a different context, different results.
Absolutely. And so, I mean, currently we only have, we've had less than 8,000 cases and only 100 deaths. However,
that's great
if we had waited another 1 or 2 weeks, it would have been completely different. And so, yeah, I mean, we certainly are quite lucky here in Australia.
Yeah.
And life is somewhat returned to normal in that we can now go out and go to the cafe, go to the restaurant, go to the beach. We don't go to big sporting events or anything like that. We still don't travel. But again, we're quite lucky in that regard, I guess.
Yeah, for sure.
So,
it's a very good. You have now very good numbers on this crazy world that we are facing.
Yeah, but what I think is interesting is that it's easy to focus just on the pandemic. But I think that when you look at it from a broader perspective and you start to think about the many different things that are happening at the moment. So, for example, because we had 4 months in Australia of catastrophic bushfires, and I know that in Brazil you have too. So we went straight from a bushfire crisis straight into the pandemic. And I don't think that these things will stop. You know, the pandemic will subside and our bushfires subsided, but the increased connectivity combined with global warming and a changing climate,
of course,
I think are only going to amplify these different types of events. And so sadly, I don't think we're going to, I think, you know, civil unrest in the United States, things like this will continue to, and I think we all need to accept that over the next decade, we're going to face continued different things, unexpected things happening. I suspect that's going to continue to play out.
That's the thing. And something that is different right now is that we have been thrown in a giant common agenda. So we are connected today because of this pandemic situation. Maybe we would have a chance to meet again when you come to Brazil in another time. So yes, we do have many good lessons to take from that. And since we are finishing our time together, I have to ask you a final question. In one of your articles, you did a very provocative question. What did your plans for 2020 look like back in early November, and how they are different now? Could you give us an overview about your thoughts in November and how you see the world is gonna unfold from now on?
I mean, back in November, I guess, you know, the pandemic wasn't on the horizon. I was living on the east coast of Australia. I was very aware of how dry, we've been in drought in Australia for a number of years. I was very concerned about the dryness of the landscape. Where I live is in the forest. And so I knew that it was going to be a long, difficult summer. I expected that the type of crisis that has been playing out with the pandemic, I expected that would play out as a result of climate change. And I thought we would be looking at these type of events in another 5 to 10 years. So I guess what has surprised me is the speed with which things have been happening, and that things have been happening faster than I thought they would. I really started diving into the world of complexity about 5 years ago, because to me it seemed fairly obvious that to understand the next few decades, you need to have an understanding of complexity. And that's why I built my business around understanding complexity, because, you know, there's a huge opportunity there. I guess, I just didn't, like most people, none of us saw the pandemic coming. I mean, I first was aware of the flu in Wuhan in early January, and I remember thinking, oh, that's something to keep an eye out for. And by late January, that's when I was starting to get concerned. But of course, but I guess in answer to your question, Flavia, the planning is kind of often I'll work off this idea of 3 different temporal scales. So 3 different time scales. What can you plan for in the very immediate term? So what can you plan for in the next 30 days? And then taking, maybe a broader or longer temporal timescale. What is probable? And you could calculate, okay, so there over the next 6 months, there might be 10 things which are probable. And there's more, which one of those 10 things is the most likely to occur. But then moving even further out, maybe a year or 2 years or 3 years, what is possible? And understanding that you can't predict what will happen, but rather what you do in the short term, the shorter temporal scales, can influence what happens across the longer temporal scales. And in the shorter temporal scales, the better you can be at detecting different weak signals, at reading the environment, picking up different threads, starting to, keeping an eye out for the outliers. So pieces of information that most people don't pay attention to. So for example, if you know how to scan in early January, the Wuhan was on your radar, and you knew that something that was possible was becoming a probability. And then it became a projection. It became, you have to plan for it because it's an inevitability. And so I guess what I'm saying, Flavia, is, I think that long-term planning, this pandemic has very quickly shown how limiting our long-term planning can be. And in an organizational sense, you often see this in terms of strategic planning. What does the next 3 or 5 years look like? And so in the consulting work that I do, for the organizations I work with, we try and not plan towards specific 3 and 5 year timeframes, and rather our strategy is simply to be a complex adaptive system, to be an organization which can adapt and learn and respond. And that in itself is the strategy. And so you therefore remove the temporal scales and you remove the need to plan, and simply, kind of what it is you're trying to do, but if something else happens, you can also reconfigure in that direction. So it's a little bit, I guess I'm much more cautious about planning. And I think that planning is planning in the short term, that's okay, but planning in the long term, that's what the pandemic showed. Planning can, your plans go out the window when things change.
Yeah, that is some of the very important lessons learned. We are learning how to live back in a complexity way of living, separating what is probable, what is a possibility, and we have to separate the complexity, the complicated, and that's a new world. We have some processes that are bases, but we have to be aware about what is happening every day. And as we were talking before, in our reality every weekend, re-evaluating our scenario and taking decisions with one focus, but not predicting what is going to happen.
I think it's about being able to hold different contexts and scales at the same time. So in terms of a temporal scale, it's about planning towards what am I going to do for the rest of today, but also knowing what am I going to be doing for the rest of the week, and what does the rest of the month kind of look like, or what might I be able to achieve. But of course, what I'm not doing is planning every day for the rest of the month, because the rest of the month has still got 3.5 weeks left, and I don't know what will happen then. But I do know with a high degree of certainty what I can achieve in my work today.
Exactly.
I do know what I can, with a relatively high degree of certainty, what I can achieve tomorrow. But then into next week, that becomes less clear. And then the week beyond that, it's even less clear. So again, it's about being able to understand and work across different temporal scales and think about them at the same time, and know that the work I'm doing in this short temporal scale is also influencing the work that will be done in the longer temporal scales.
That's it.
If that makes sense.
Yeah. That's the new way of.
That's the new way. Yeah.
of living the new normal, as we used to say here in Brazil, the new normal each day. Patrick, we are out of time. I have to say a huge thank you very, very much. It's a pleasure to have you again at Tecnopuc in our virtual Tecnopuc, and I hope to see you again here so we can share a coffee again and walk around in our campus.
Yeah. I look forward to that. You're good friends over there, so thank you for having me, and it's been it's been good to speak.
Thank you very much, Patrick. See you soon.
All right. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.